Hey friends, I'm Saf, and I'm going to talk to you today about how to make an Ember Day tart. So, while I currently reside in the peaceful and mercantile barony of St Florian de la Riviere, I initially joined the SCA in the barony of Rowaney, and about the time I joined, Ember Day tart was a common staple of almost every feast and potluck. And that makes sense because it's cheap and simple and it feeds the masses. And more importantly, in this time of social distancing, it's made of ingredients that almost everyone has at home. So the recipe I'm using today comes from the 14th century from the form of cury, compiled by the master cooks of Richard II. And the version that I'm using is the one transcribed and annotated by Samuel Pegg in 1780, and it is as follows. Take and parboil onions, press out the water and hew them small. Take bread and braid it in a mortar and temper it up with ayron, and do thereto butter, saffron, salt and raisins currants, and a little sugar with powdered juice, and bake it in a trap and serve it forth. So to start with, I'm going to make the pastry case and blind bake it. And blind baking just ensures that we don't end up with raw, uncooked pastry at the bottom of our tart case. Say no to soggy bottoms. So what I'm doing here is trimming my pastry to a nice manageable size, and then I'm going to put it in the pie dish. Or not, because I have in fact forgotten to butter my pie dish, which is super important if we want this tart to actually come out at the end of this whole process. So what I'm actually using here is store-bought pastry, and it's just a frozen puff that we got in the freezer section. And of course you could always go ahead and make your own pastry for this, for the full immersive culinary experience, but you know what, this is what we had to hand. Ideally a short crust would have probably been better, but we're also out of short crust, so you know what, we make do. This is the corona times. So once I've eased this pastry gently into my pre-buttered pie dish, I'm then going to trim it and make it all super neat and make sure that I don't have any giant blobs of pastry that aren't going to cook in the oven. So once I've got it all trimmed and neatened up, I'm then going to get my piece of baking paper, put it in my pie dish, and fill it with pie weights. I'm using ceramic pie weights, but of course if you don't have those you could use beans or rice, but I really feel like in times of global pandemic we really shouldn't be using valuable foodstuffs as pie weights. So the pastry case is then baked in the oven at 200 degrees Celsius, that's about 70 bald eagles for those of you who use freedom units, for about 20 minutes. While our pastry is baking, it's time to cut the onions. As we will later discover, I only needed one onion because I dramatically overestimated how much these would cook down. But you know what? The scaled recipe is in the description below, so you can do as I say, not as I do. Anyways, brown or white onions are best for this. You can use red onions if you really want to, but honestly, the flavour of a white or a brown onion is nice and oniony, and it contrasts really well with the currants. If you wanted to use red, you could, but I don't think it's as good, so maybe just leave them in salads. I like to slice these in semicircles because it's aesthetic, but you could dice them if you prefer. I mean, you're kind of the onion god in this recipe. You can cut them however you want. This is medieval kitchen anarchy. Once the onions are chopped, it's time to take them inside and cook them. The important thing here is just to make sure that they are thinly sliced enough to soften quickly when we cook them in butter. That's right, we're ignoring the bit about boiling them in water. Why? Because onions taste better in butter, and we need to melt some butter for the filling anyways. So I'm melting my butter in a small saucepan on medium heat. For the love of God, don't burn your butter. You can also use any other kind of oil, fat you want. Butter is better, so I'd probably just go with that. But you could use olive oil, margarine, whatever. Pick your poison. Add the onions, and then we wait what feels like forever for them to soften. And stir so that they don't burn on the bottom of the pan, because no one likes that. As an interesting aside, while we wait for these bad boys to cook, we commonly see Ember Day tart associated with Lent. But there are actually 4 Ember tides throughout the year, each composed of 3 Ember days for fasting and religious contemplation. I'm not really sure why food then comes into it, but you know what? Let's not look a gift horse in the mouth. Ember Day tart is beautiful, and we all need it in our lives. Interestingly, there's also an old wives' tale about Ember Day being used to predict the weather in northern Spain. Supposedly, each of the 3 Ember days in an Embertide predicts the weather for each of the subsequent 3 months. Don't know if that's true or not, but it's kind of cool. Okay, so these onions are almost done. What we're looking for is soft, pliable onions that are slightly translucent, and that delightful aroma of onion and butter filling the whole kitchen. Once they're done, we'll decant them into a suitable vessel of holding and allow them to cool slightly before we add them to the filling. Alright, so now it's time to assemble our filling. First I'm adding the onions, followed by the breadcrumbs. I'm using fresh breadcrumbs, but you could use what you have to hand. Panko crumbs are best. I wouldn't recommend the stuff you use to coat a schnitzel because it tends to have a wet sand texture once you cook it. Next we're adding the currants, and trying not to spill them all over the table. I like to add only half to the mix because they tend to sink to the bottom when you pour them into the pastry case, and then I sprinkle the other half on top. Next we're adding the saffron. This is an optional extra. I think it adds a nice, slightly fragrant flavour to it, but if you don't have saffron and you don't have the budget for saffron, absolutely leave that out. Then it's time for powder juice. This is a medieval spice mix made of cinnamon, ginger, pepper and cloves, but you can make it to whatever ratios you like. I happen to like mine with a little extra cinnamon and ginger just for that sort of fiery kick, but it's up to you. Once the powder juice is in, give everything a bit of a mix just to make sure that all of those ingredients are incorporated properly. And then we attempt to add the eggs without getting any eggshell in. Ideally, you'd want to be cracking each egg into a cup or a small bowl just to make sure that they aren't rotten or any sort of bits of shell can be easily gotten out. But you know what? Here, we just die like men. So when I'm adding the third egg, I'm going to try and be a little bit more careful when I crack this, just so I can save a little bit of that egg white. What I want to do is brush the inside of my tart case, hot out of the oven, with the egg white so that it seals everything in and stops all that filling from making the nice and crispy pastry super soggy. Once that's done, we can give our filling a bit of a mix. You want to make sure everything is fairly well incorporated and that egg is homogeneous the whole way through without weird clumps of egg yolk or egg white sticking out in the final product. Then you can attempt to daintily scoop your filling into your pie case and then promptly give up and just pour it in, because you know what? This is why bowls with spouts were invented. We want to make sure that we only fill this tart case to just below the rim because the eggs do expand in the oven. And at this point, we also realize that I have made way too much filling and this was just ridiculous. But we carry on. Add your currants that you've reserved from before and sprinkle them artistically over the top because this is your masterwork. To finish everything off, we add a tiny little sprinkle of white sugar on top. It gives it a lovely little crust to add it on top rather than mixing it into the filling itself, and you hardly even notice the sweetness. So at this point, we then bung this in the oven at 180 degrees Celsius for about half an hour, covering with foil if it starts to get a little too brown on top. And here it is, our fresh out of the oven Ember Day tart, all perfect and delicious and tasty. As you can imagine, it was promptly devoured. Well friends, I hope you enjoyed watching this video. We certainly enjoyed making it, and we hope it's inspired you to bring a little bit of medieval flavour to your own kitchen. Did you try the recipe, or perhaps you tried the 16th century one with cheese? If you did, let us know in the comments below, and until next time.